Less than 2 weeks until Halloween, and I'd say it's the perfect time to draw a creepy but cute monster that you can customize to fit your own style and interests. Grab your paper, a pencil with an eraser, and a fine-tipped pen. I'll be using a black Micron Fine liner, size 005 or 2mm. Starting with the pencil, I'm sketching the head, or specifically the skull, first. I'm drawing the majority of an oval, but adding 3 bumps along the bottom. For the antlers, it's almost like I'm drawing a road with multiple dead ends. While most of the points are rounded, I'd like one of them to be broken and cracked, so there's a bit of a jagged top. The pencil lines don't need to be perfect, truly they don't. They'll just serve as a guide for when we come back through later with pen. For the eyes, I like to draw them quite large, sort of an imperfect circular shape. Do you notice how they slant downward slightly on the outside? If we were to slant them towards the center instead, the eyes would look angry and not as innocent. As I make the body, I'm leaving a large section for the hind leg, and on the other side, the leg and the hand will just peek out. Those fingers are not looking great, but once again, it doesn't really matter if the pencil sketches are accurate or not, because we're going to be able to make little revisions and make things how we want it once we get the pen out. I'm adding some bat-like wings next, with a few points along the bottom. And for the tail, see how I'm drawing straight through the wing and then erasing? This can be an easier way to tackle overlapping objects if you're just starting out. And I probably should have placed the wing in the front. It would have been the more natural placement, but I'm just going to pretend that this guy's tail is super long and that it's coming around towards the front side of his body in front of the wing. This will give us the opportunity to address the entire tail, which is great practice for shading. If some of those imperfect lines, the pencil sketches, are kind of bothering you, like the hand for example, then go ahead and fix it if you want to. But I actually prefer to just make adjustments as I go when I come back through with the pen. I'm now adding the hint of the ground, and I'm going to add some mushrooms here with eyes on them. And we'll also have a few kind of like dead shrubs all around the scene. And in this stage, when we're just doing the pencil sketch, I'm not making any effort to do any sort of shading. We're going to be doing all of that with the pen. For now, we're just focused on the outline and just a little bit of a guide, nothing more than that. In the front here, I'm going to add a tiny skull and make this into like a little skull flower or flower skull. I'm not really sure how you would put it. And as I put my leaves on, I'm spacing them out and I'm adding the leaves that will be in the front first, and then I come back through and then add the leaves that are sort of behind those first ones. In my last video, we did a few short exercises to get in the habit of adding stippling to your own doodles. And while it's not necessary to watch that one before this one, you might find it helpful. I'll link it here, and I'll also include it in the description below if you're interested. Okay, let's add an eyeball to each of these mushrooms. I'm not going to go into any detail at all, just the outline again. And then I think we're about ready to get into the pen. Okay, I think I'm going to speed the pen section up to about 1.5 times the speed. Otherwise, it will take quite a while to get through. So what I'm doing first is I'm going along the outline of the pencil, and I'm using the stippling, just basically making little tiny dots all along. And what I often like to do is sort of a cross between dragging and stippling, where I'm just barely lifting my pen, and it creates these broken lines. So it's similar to a pen outline, but not as harsh. And as I make my way around, I'm going to consider which areas I want to have more shadows and which areas I want to leave lighter. I'm going to pretend that I have a sun or some sort of light source in my upper right corner. That means that my left sides and the bottom will have to be a lot darker than the upper right portions. So see, as I make my way around this antler, Some parts will hardly have any dots at all, whereas others will be much more concentrated, resulting in a darker value. And I personally think that antlers and any sort of bones are so wonderful for this exercise. Just because of the unusual shapes, it really kind of makes you think about where the light source and where the shadows will be. And I hope you guys don't mind if I ramble a bit in this video. I normally have a little bit more of a plan, some sort of a script, but with this one, I'm just kind of gonna go with it. So there might be a lot of talking as we walk through all of these steps. And you can certainly take your time a lot more than I am and create those nice little evenly spaced dots. But you know, depending on the style, sometimes I don't really think it's necessary. Like this one, for example, when it's sort of like a dark, grungy look to it, I don't mind if things are kind of broken, uneven, maybe not as perfect as you might want them for some other drawings. And do you see how I made the broken antler a little bit darker in that area and sort of emphasized the crack going down a little bit? And now I'm working my way around the part that has a little more sunshine or light source, and so that won't require quite as many dots. But as I get to the underneath, that part, of course, will be in the shade. For the eyes, I'm going to work my way around the perimeter first. And then I think for the eyes, why don't we go ahead and use a cross hatching? So I'm going to come in very lightly at first. I'm going down with my lines first, and then once that's done, I'll work my way across. And because we're pretending these are holes, like these are empty, hollow caves inside of the skull, so we really do want to make sure we have some nice dark values here, especially in the upper right portion of each eye. I'm filling in the nose slightly. And now as I move on to the wings, I'm doing sort of that stippling, dragging method again. And then coming in and shading with stippling. And you know, I do like hatching and cross hatching, but I have to say, as a beginner myself, I always get a little nervous when it comes to making those lines. They just feel so much more definitive than little tiny dots. And so I'm personally a lot more comfortable doing most of my shading with stippling. And don't worry about doing too much shading at this point. We will be coming back through a little bit later after we've erased our lines. And at that point, we'll get a chance to just sort of reinforce everything and evaluate what needs to be darker. For now, our main objective is just sort of getting that outline and the basic shape done. And as you work on the monster's torso, you might decide that you want a little bit of like hair or fur, and so you can actually be doing small lines and dashes instead of just stippling, but it really just depends on what kind of texture you want to go for. Let's see if I can fix these fingers as I come in here and go over it with pen. And I'm still paying attention to shading. So the underside is going to be a little darker. And of course, this hand as a whole is not going to be getting a whole lot of light, so it will be darker than the other one. I'd love to hear whether any of you are participating in Inktober. This is my first time joining in, and I'm actually getting way more out of it than I'd imagined. I've always been one of those people who takes out a sketchbook every now and then, but this is probably the first time I've drawn something every day for almost a month straight since high school art class. And believe me, that was a long time ago. I've been looking into daily art challenges for November, and I heard of one called Huevember, where basically every day you create a piece of art using a different color, and I thought that sounded like a lot of fun. I always kind of like to do like a different theme with my sketchbooks, so I'm thinking I might go with Gnome-vember. So every day will be a different little sketch of a gnome, and it'll be done in just one color. So I'll be working on varying my different values of that particular color. As I work on this little foot that's peeking out here, I know that like the hand, he's going to be a lot darker than the one on the opposite side. So this one over here, I know that I need to leave a little bit lighter. And cruising down the back here, I know that this portion would be getting a lot of sunlight, but I think I would also get a little bit of shading from the monster's head, so I do want to keep that in mind as well. I know I'm not the best at determining where the light spot should be and where the shading should be, but I do think this is a really good exercise as far as improving that skill. If this is your first time on this channel, then I would like to welcome you and invite you to watch my intro video to see if you'd like to join me. And just so you know, I'm a huge fan of art and I love to try everything I can get my hands on. I'm not a trained artist, but I am at a point in my life where I'm dedicated to learning and experimenting, even when that means failing. And so on this channel, I like to share with my audience what has worked for me and what hasn't. I'm curious if you have like a go-to doodle that you always like to draw. You know, like when you're waiting on hold to make a doctor's appointment or writing out your to-do list and you find yourself scribbling along the margins of your paper. Well, for me, I gravitate towards little skulls, eyeballs, crystal balls, mushrooms, ghosts. It's pretty much Halloween all year long. As I'd mentioned before, the tail is a really good place to practice this shading. And what I'm doing is considering the areas that don't see much light, whether they're blocked by the wing or just because of how the tail is situated. Some areas might be darker. And you might also decide that you want to add some little curved lines to accentuate the rounded shape of the tail, or you can just stick with the stippling. And I do want the bottom part of this tail to be a little bit darker than the top. All right, let's go ahead and get started on the ground. So as I work on this part, I'm going to be using sort of that jerky little dragging motion, especially for these dead trees here. The more I use a really jerky, shaky hand, the more I think the branches look like they're cracked and brittle and sort of just dying. These are definitely not healthy little trees. See the shape of this mushroom stem? I love working on these curved shapes to challenge myself to shade them in a way that almost like gives them some movement. And it's just about time to add those eyeballs. This is the point where I add the smaller details, like the pupil and the hint of some eyelashes. I like using the 005 micron because the tip is even smaller than my pencil, so it's really great for adding detail. And I might have mentioned this before, but I had previously been using a variety of pen sizes, switching between a larger tip for the darker values and a smaller tip for the lighter values. But I quickly found that I actually prefer the look of just one size throughout, and instead I'm just kind of varying how close the dots are situated rather than the size of the pen tip. I like the look we have going for the mushrooms so far, especially the one on the right. I added some small broken lines underneath his eye, and I think it gives sort of the look of like bags under the eye or maybe some wrinkles. And as I'm looking at this tiny mushroom down below, I think what I'd like to do is leave his stem a little bit lighter and see if we can just get that to pop a little if we darken the background on the other one. So I'm adding a little bit of stippling to the left side where we would have some shadows, but I'm really going to do my best to leave the right side very light. And let's see if we can just get it dark all around there and get that to pop. Okay, not bad for now. We'll come back through later and we'll finalize a little bit of that. Now back to some more of these little dead trees. I really do like to approach these with a shaky hand. Oh, and I forgot that little eyeball, so I'll just come back in and fill in the details there. All right, and moving on to the other dead tree. And we might come in later and add a few little leaves or dried flowers or something. We'll see how it goes. And now on to the skull flower. Oh, and I sort of messed up a little on his mouth part. He originally had 3 bumps. Now he only has 2. But it's fine. We can still work with it. And I do want the eyes to be fairly dark because, again, they are like little empty caves there. And for the petals, I'm going to start by outlining each one. And as I'm doing this, I'm adding a little bit extra shape here and there. I really like the look of the imperfect petals. I don't want them all to be perfectly rounded. And so I will occasionally come in with like a little rip or a tear or just sort of a bend or a fold in the leaves. And let's see, why don't we throw in some hatching here? I'm trying to follow along the movement of the petals. So not only are we giving it some shading, but we're also providing more structure for the flower and kind of showing what the movement looks like. I really do feel so awkward just kind of talking in front of the camera without any sort of script. So I'm pretty sure I'm going to come back through and listen to this and just cringe the entire time. And see how that leaf has like a little nick taken out of it? And then we're going to do the same thing with the hatching, making sure that down at the bottom left corner, we have the darkest values, leading up to lighter values. Another dead tree or dead shrub, whatever these are. And you know, if you wanted to really get creative here, you could also add like some cute little skulls or maybe some ghosts that would be like instead of flowers on these trees. I think that would be really fun. And you know, I'll go ahead and add a handful of dried flowers to my trees. And I suppose we should probably have a shadow underneath our monster. He does cast a shadow after all. So let's add some hatching at this point because it will be a lot faster than stippling. Plus we want to make sure we get a dark value. And we do of course want to make sure we're getting the darkest right underneath him. And then it sort of lightens out ever so slightly on the outer perimeter of the shadow. And I'm not going to get too fancy and worry about the shape of the shadow. We're just going to make sure he's casting one. All right, let's come on through with the eraser now and see what we're left with. I'm sure there will be some areas that we need to improve upon, and that's totally fine. And you might want to add shadows for your mushrooms and bushes as well. I can tell right off the bat that I want to come back through to those very darkest areas, so it'll be the bottom left sections. And I'm just going to reinforce a little bit of a line, not a hard, solid line, but just provide a little more structure in certain areas. And I know that I want his eyes to be darker. And see how I'm just adding like a little sprinkling of dots throughout as well? I really don't like to leave huge areas of space white, and so I'm just adding some texture here and there. Of course, there will be certain scenarios where you want to leave parts of your paper super clean and white, but I think when it comes to something like this, like working on a skull, you want to make sure you have some grit to it and some texture. So, hence the sprinkling of random dots. And it doesn't have to be random dots. It can be a dash, a broken line here and there, and it adds to the character and the interest of the piece. So, are you totally sick of making all these dots yet? I know it might be tempting to go for a larger size tip, and there's nothing wrong with that at all, but I have a feeling ultimately you will find yourself reaching for that smaller tip because, like I said, it's just a lot easier to work on your values, distinguishing between the lightest, sort of the mid-tones, and then those really dark ones. Whereas if you're constantly working with the large tip pen, it can be really hard to get those light values to stay light unless you are leaving the spots completely white and blank. Of course, it all comes down to personal preference. It's your artwork after all, no one else's. So it's just something to consider. And sorry, I forgot to mention it, but I was coming through here with some more hatching just on the wings, sort of in between like those ridges. And so what I was trying to accomplish was to add just the smallest amount of shading, but I also wanted to show the shape of those wings. The wings are certainly not flat, they are very curved, and so we do want to be able to show that. Well, I think this might be the longest video I've ever made. So I'm curious to know whether you guys like this style where we're just kind of drawing along together, taking our time, or whether you'd prefer it if I really condense things a little more and cut the unnecessary parts that you don't necessarily need to see and just touch on the important highlights. So yeah, just let me know what you think and I will definitely keep it in mind for future videos. The really cool thing about stippling is that you can take the drawing as far as you want. You can leave it like kind of how we have it, where it's just an outline and the main shaded parts, or you can just cover your entire page full of all these little tiny details. And so I think that's a really, really cool aspect of this technique. And do you see how I filled in the cracks in between the petals? That's where I would want my darkest values. And then along the outside here, I'm just adding some little detail, the dots and dashes like we talked about before. All right, good news. It's time for my favorite part. This is where we're going to add those extra details that will make your monster unique. And so I'm starting with a crack down the center of his skull using jerky motions and then filling it in just slightly. See these hash marks? I think it makes him look like he's all scuffed up. So if you like the look of that, go ahead and add a few. And then how about some stitches? I'm going to add a gash down the side of his back here and some stitches. And this little guy has definitely had a rough day. If you want, you can add some nails or claws. And I think I will add a few claws to the tips of his wings, because why not? I have a feeling my daughter would refer to our monster as a goofy goober. How do you feel about freckles or whiskers? I don't know about you, but I am definitely going for the freckles. So I'm just adding slightly larger dots so they do stand out amongst the stipples. And you know what? Let's go ahead and add some ears too while we're at it. You can see how mine turn out and decide then whether you want to add ears or not. This might be a huge mistake. And to fill in those ears, I'm going to use some hatching. Paying attention again to the motion and the shape of the ears, starting darkest in the bottom left. You know, I don't actually mind how that's looking at all. I think he looks kind of like a beaver now. And it definitely looks like he needs something in his hand. So I'm going to place a wilted flower in his hand. But you know, you might want to put a paintbrush, maybe some knitting needles, a little handheld garden shovel. Maybe he's outside doing some yard work today. Have some fun with it and make it your own. I should have mentioned this earlier, but normally when I'm not recording, I move my paper around constantly. I am rotating my paper. Sometimes it's completely upside down. I just move it to whichever way feels most comfortable. That just really helps me a lot so that I can get more fluid motions when I'm drawing. I would encourage you to turn on an audiobook, a podcast, or some music, and just take your sweet time, enjoy the process. It can even be a relaxing experience. But, you know, maybe not when you're recording a video and trying your best to stay out of the way of the camera. I'm going to include some stars. I like making these twinkle stars with 4 points. You might also decide to add a moon, a comet, a shooting star. I think it would look really cool to make the whole background black and then let the stars pop, but I'm just not up for that today. So there we have it. The Goofy Goober is complete. I hope you had fun with this video, and thank you so much. I know it was a long one, but I do appreciate you watching. Thanks.